There is a forest in Japan that has stood for over 1,000 years, and if you walk far enough into it, past the cedar groves and the moss-covered stones and the shrine gates that appear at intervals like punctuation in a sentence you are only beginning to read, you will eventually notice something that the forest itself seems designed to prevent you from noticing too quickly. The trees are almost perfectly spaced. Not in the way that a plantation is spaced, not in the mechanical rows of a timber operation, not with the industrial regularity that announces itself immediately as human intervention. The spacing is subtler than that. It is the kind of spacing that at first you attribute to the forest's own logic, to the competition of roots and canopy, to the way trees naturally thin themselves over centuries. And then you walk a little further, and you pay a slightly different kind of attention, and the pattern does not go away. If anything, it deepens. The forest is Yakushima, on a remote island in southern Japan, and its ancient Sugi cedars, some of them dated to over 7,000 years of age, making them among the oldest living organisms on Earth, grow in a distribution that foresters and ecologists have spent decades trying to fully explain. The explanations that exist are not wrong, but they are, in certain specific ways, incomplete. And the incompleteness, if you follow it carefully, leads somewhere that the science has not yet gone with any great confidence. It leads to the possibility that someone in an era before writing, before cities, before anything we would conventionally recognize as civilization, may have shaped this forest with intention. The science of old-growth forest ecology is a mature field, and its basic conclusions are well established. Old-growth forests, defined roughly as forests that have developed over long periods without significant human disturbance, are characterized by structural complexity, biological diversity, and a distribution of trees that reflects centuries of competition, mortality, gap-phase regeneration, and species-specific responses to soil and light and water. They are not random, they have patterns. But those patterns are the patterns of ecological process, of disturbance and recovery, of succession and climax, and they are well understood, at least in their broad outlines. What is less often discussed, in part because it sits at an uncomfortable intersection between archaeology, botany, and a history that predates most written records, is the growing body of evidence suggesting that many of the forests we classify as old growth, as pristine, as undisturbed, were in fact shaped by sustained human activity over periods so long that the shaping is no longer visible as shaping. It has been absorbed into the forest itself, encoded in the distribution of species, in the structure of the canopy, in the composition of the soil, and then, over centuries without the people who made it, mistaken for nature. This is not a fringe position. It appears, carefully worded but unmistakable in its implications, in mainstream ecological literature. It is discussed in the work of researchers at institutions that could not be described as speculative, and it raises a question that the field has not yet resolved. If human management can, over a long enough timescale, become indistinguishable from natural process, then how much of what we call wilderness is, in some meaningful sense, a garden? You may already be aware that the Amazon rainforest contains extensive evidence of pre-Columbian human modification, the terra preta soils, the geometric earthworks, the overrepresentation of useful plant species near archaeological sites. This evidence has been accumulating for 2 decades, and it has substantially revised the scientific consensus about the human history of the world's largest tropical forest. But the Amazon is not unique in this. It is, because of its scale and its accessibility to modern survey technology, simply the most extensively documented case. In Central Africa, the Congo Basin, the second largest tropical forest on Earth, contains evidence of similar patterns. A study published in 2017 in the journal Science Advances examined pollen records and charcoal deposits from across the Congo and found evidence of large-scale, sustained human activity during a period roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. the activity was agricultural in nature, and it was followed by what the researchers described as a dramatic forest regeneration, the trees returning to cleared land, the canopy closing, the signs of human presence being absorbed into the vegetation over the centuries that followed. What the study found, buried in pollen cores and sediment layers, was a civilization that had modified a substantial portion of the Congo Basin, and then, for reasons that the data does not clearly illuminate, was no longer there. The forest grew back, and when the first modern observers moved through the Congo in the 19th century, they saw a wilderness. What they were actually seeing was a recovery, a second growth, mistaken for the original. In western England, between the Severn and the Wye rivers, there is a forest that has been continuously documented since Roman times and that carries within its ecology a set of anomalies that foresters and historians have spent centuries discussing without arriving at a complete explanation. The Forest of Dean is a royal forest, one of the oldest in England, with a legal and administrative history stretching back before the Norman conquest. Its oaks are remarkable, some of them extremely old, distributed across the landscape in a way that does not map neatly onto either a natural forest pattern or a conventional plantation. Certain species appear in certain places, in certain densities, for reasons that soil analysis and hydrological mapping can account for only partially. What historians do know is that the forest was intensively managed by human communities for millennia before the Norman kings claimed it as royal hunting ground. The local population, the Forest of Dean, has its own distinct cultural identity, preserved by geography into the modern era, maintained rights and access and use that predated any written legal framework and that appear, in their specificity, to reflect a very long tradition of practical knowledge about the forest's ecology. They knew which trees to leave, which areas to clear, which soils would support what species, in a way that was not written down anywhere, but was transmitted generation to generation in practice. When that tradition was disrupted, when the management practices that had maintained the forest's particular character were interrupted by enclosure, by industrial timber extraction, by the kind of institutional intervention that does not care about accumulated local knowledge, the forest changed, species composition shifted. The old pattern, maintained across centuries, began to break down, and the foresters who came afterward, working without the knowledge that had been lost, found themselves unable to fully account for why the forest had been the way it was, or how to restore it. The Forest of Dean is a small example, local and relatively well documented, of a phenomenon that appears at much larger scales and in much less documented contexts across every forested region of the world. The pattern of the forest reflected the knowledge of the people who tended it. When the people were gone, the knowledge was gone with them, and the forest, over time, became something else, something that the next observers, arriving without context, could only describe as natural. There is a specific botanical anomaly that appears with enough consistency across different forests and different continents to warrant careful attention. In many of the world's oldest forests, the distribution of certain valuable or useful tree species, species that produce edible fruits or nuts, species with medicinal properties, species whose wood has particular qualities, their distribution does not follow the dispersal patterns that their biology would predict. Seeds travel by wind, by water, by the animals that eat them and deposit them elsewhere. These mechanisms are well understood, and for most species they produce distributions that can be modeled with reasonable accuracy. For certain species, in certain forests, the models do not fit. The trees are in places they should not be, in densities that natural dispersal cannot account for, growing alongside other species in combinations that appear to a botanist paying close attention less like ecological coincidence and more like a considered arrangement. In Borneo, several species of dipterocarp, the towering emergent trees that form the upper canopy of the island's ancient forests, appear in patterns that correspond, when overlaid on archaeological survey data, with known areas of prehistoric human settlement. The correlation is not perfect. It is not the kind of correlation that produces a headline, but it is consistent enough that researchers in the field have begun, cautiously, to discuss the possibility that the distribution of these species reflects, in part, a history of human planting or management that predates the current forest by thousands of years. In West Africa, the distribution of the oil palm, a species of enormous economic and cultural importance across the region, extends far beyond the range that natural dispersal could explain. The oil palm is where it is, across a vast stretch of equatorial Africa, partly because people put it there. That much is accepted. What is less settled is how far back that human dispersal extends, and what the forests of the region looked like when the planting began, and how much of what we now call natural West African forest is, in some layered and complicated sense, the result of decisions made by people whose names we do not know. Return for a moment to the question of spacing, because it is in the geometry of old forests that the anomaly becomes most difficult to attribute to any single conventional explanation. The Yakushima cedars are not the only ancient trees whose distribution has struck careful observers as something other than purely random. The ancient yew forests of Europe, scattered survivors of what was once a much more extensive yew woodland, tend to cluster around sites of pre-Christian religious significance, megalithic monuments, sacred springs, later church sites that were themselves built on earlier sacred ground. The yews at these sites are often extraordinarily old, some of them dated by dendrochronology and other methods to ages in excess of 2,000, 3,000, in a handful of cases possibly 4,000 or 5,000 years. The conventional explanation for the association between ancient yews and sacred sites is that the longevity of the trees made them objects of veneration, that people came to worship where the trees were old. This is plausible. It is probably partially correct. But there is a direction in which this explanation does not reach. It does not account for the possibility that the association runs the other way, that the trees were planted at the sacred sites, not found there. That the act of planting a tree whose descendants would still be living 1,000 years later was itself a form of intention, a message composed in wood and bark and root system, addressed to a future the planter could not see but clearly considered worth addressing. If the yews were planted, and at some of these sites the hypothesis is not easily dismissed, then whoever planted them possessed a kind of temporal imagination that we do not typically attribute to prehistoric people, an understanding of deep time, of the relationship between present action and distant consequence that shaped the landscape in ways still visible today. And if that kind of intention existed, if people 3,000 years ago were planting trees and arranging forests with an awareness of how those choices would manifest across millennia, then the question of what else they may have arranged and in what other landscapes their arrangements are still visible but unrecognized is one that the available tools of archaeology and ecology have not yet fully asked. There is a category of loss that is harder to measure than the loss of monuments or artifacts or written records, because it leaves no obvious absence, no empty pedestal, no gap in the archive. It is the loss of ecological knowledge, the accumulated understanding held in practice and transmitted in practice across generations of how to tend a landscape over time. This knowledge existed in sophisticated forms among indigenous communities across every forested region of the world. The Australian Aboriginal practice of fire stick farming, the deliberate use of fire to manage vegetation, promote useful species, and maintain ecological diversity across the continent, was so effective and so long-standing that the Australian landscape, as Europeans encountered it in the 18th and 19th centuries, reflected in its composition and structure thousands of years of deliberate human management. The explorers who described it as wilderness were describing the output of an agricultural system they could not recognize as one. Similar practices existed, in different forms adapted to different ecologies, among the forest peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Amazon Basin, the Congo, the forests of South and Southeast Asia, In every case, the practice was not writing, but doing, not theory, but technique, held in the hands and the seasonal rhythms and the place-specific knowledge of communities whose relationship to the land was so intimate and so long that it had become, in a sense, indistinguishable from the land itself. When those communities were disrupted by disease, by displacement, by the various forms of colonial violence that erased both populations and practices across the last 5 centuries, the knowledge did not survive in any recoverable form. What survived was the forest. But the forest, without the hands that tended it, began to change. And the change, happening slowly across decades and centuries, was visible only to those who had known what the forest had been before. By the time the scientists arrived with their instruments and their sampling protocols, the baseline was already gone. They were measuring a forest in recovery or in decline and calling it pristine. They were reading the second chapter of a book whose first chapter no longer exists. There is a particular quality to the oldest forests, the ones that have been standing long enough to absorb the full complexity of whatever history passed through them, that is difficult to describe without reaching for language that science tends to regard with some suspicion. They feel deliberate. They feel, in some register that is not quite rational, tended. This may be nothing more than the human tendency to find pattern where none exists, to impose intention on the indifferent processes of ecology and geology. That tendency is real, and it is responsible for many of the errors of perception that careful thinking is designed to correct. But it may also be something else. It may be a perception that is, in its quiet and unverifiable way, accurate, a recognition operating below the threshold of conscious analysis of the difference between a place that was shaped by time alone and a place that was shaped by time and by people together, over a span so long that the two are now impossible to separate. The oldest forests are archives. They contain, in the distribution of their species, in the chemistry of their soils, in the geometry of their canopies, a record of every influence that has acted upon them across their histories. Some of those influences are geological, some are climatic, and some, it is increasingly clear, are human. The residue of choices made by people who understood in a way that we are only beginning to recover that a forest is not a place you pass through, but a thing you participate in creating, slowly, across more time than any individual life can hold. What they were creating, and why, and whether the patterns we are beginning to identify in the world's oldest forests are the coherent expression of a knowledge system we cannot yet read, these questions are open. They may remain open for a long time. The trees, in any case, are not going anywhere. They are still there, still growing, still encoding in their rings and their root systems and their relationships with the soil a history that no archive has yet contained. The question is whether we will learn to read them before the knowledge of how to do so disappears again, as it has, quietly and completely, so many times before.